In this episode, we're going to take something that often feels like a pile of confusing labels and turn it into a clear way of thinking that helps you make better security decisions. When people first hear phrases like malware family or campaign, it can sound like the security world is casually naming monsters and inventing stories about them. The reality is more practical and more disciplined than it looks from the outside, because defenders need a way to connect what they see on their own systems to patterns that have been observed elsewhere. When those connections are done carefully, they turn isolated technical clues into a bigger picture that explains intent, methods, and likely next steps. The goal here is not to memorize names or chase headlines, but to learn how to connect malware families to credible campaigns in a way that is grounded in evidence, aware of uncertainty, and useful to a team that has to respond. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To do that well, you first need to understand what people mean by a malware family, because it is not as neat as a biological family tree. A malware family is usually a group of malicious programs that share meaningful similarities, such as common code, shared behaviors, the same command and control patterns, or a consistent way of packaging and delivering the payload. Sometimes the similarity comes from a single developer reusing code over time, and sometimes it comes from many people using the same toolkit or building on a leaked or purchased codebase. That means a family name is often a label that helps analysts talk about a cluster of related samples, but the boundaries of that cluster can shift as new information appears. If you treat family names as perfect categories, you will misunderstand what they are for, because they are really a shorthand for a set of observed relationships, not a guarantee of identity. A campaign is a different kind of idea, and it is easy to mix it up with a family if you are new. A campaign is typically a coordinated set of actions carried out by an adversary over a period of time, usually with a consistent objective, target set, and operational pattern. A campaign can involve multiple malware families, and the same malware family can appear in multiple campaigns, because malware is often a tool that gets reused. Think of a campaign as the story of what an attacker is trying to accomplish and how they move toward that goal, while a malware family is more like the tool set being used during some portion of that story. The link between the two is not automatic, and you do not earn credibility by forcing a link where the evidence is weak. Credible connections come from showing that the malware you see is part of a broader, coherent pattern of activity that matches other observed events. Now we can talk about what it means to connect a family to a campaign in a responsible way, because the phrase sounds simple, but the practice is subtle. The connection is not a single magic clue, like finding one file name and declaring victory, because any single clue can be spoofed, borrowed, or coincidental. Instead, you look for convergence across multiple kinds of evidence that reinforce each other, like pieces of a puzzle that fit together from different angles. The basic idea is to move from low-confidence signals, which are easy to fake or common across many threats, to higher confidence signals, which are harder to fake and more unique to a particular operator or tool chain. You also want to consider time, because campaigns have timelines, and evidence that lines up temporally can strengthen a claim. When you combine these ideas, you stop thinking in terms of one smoking gun and start thinking in terms of a balanced case. A useful way to organize your thinking is to separate what you observe into behavior, infrastructure, and artifacts, because each category has strengths and weaknesses. Behavior includes what the malware does on a system, such as how it persists, how it communicates, what processes it spawns, and what kind of data it touches. Infrastructure includes things like domain names, IP addresses, hosting patterns, certificate reuse, and the structure of command and control. Artifacts include hashes, file names, compile timestamps, embedded strings, and the packaging of the malware. Artifacts can be very easy to share and easy to match, which makes them tempting, but they can also be changed quickly, so you should not treat them as the strongest basis for a campaign claim. Behavior and infrastructure often take more effort to alter, especially if they are tied to how the operator actually works, so they can become more meaningful when you see repeated patterns. Even before you get fancy, It helps to understand that many common indicators are not unique, and that is where beginners often make their first big mistake. A hash match is powerful for saying two samples are identical, but it is weak for saying two campaigns are the same, because attackers can recompile, pack, or slightly change code and produce a completely different hash. A file name can be changed in seconds, so it is rarely decisive, and a compile timestamp can be faked or misleading. Even an IP address can be shared by many unrelated actors, especially when they use common hosting providers or compromised servers. This is why credible linkage depends on clusters of evidence, not just one or two easy matches. You want to train yourself to ask, if an attacker wanted to mislead me, would this clue still hold, or is it exactly the kind of thing they could plant to waste my time? It also helps to know that naming makes things messy, because different groups often use different names for the same family, and sometimes the same name for different things. Vendors and researchers may brand a family differently, and a name might reflect a behavior, a code base, a target region, or simply the first sample that was found. When you see two reports that seem to disagree, the problem is often not that one is lying, but that they are labeling different slices of the same reality. A disciplined analyst focuses on what the malware does and how it is built, not just what it is called. If two sources use different names but describe the same communication pattern, the same encryption scheme, and the same set of modules, you may be looking at a naming difference rather than a threat difference. That is why connecting families to campaigns is less about memorizing vocabulary and more about learning to recognize consistent patterns. As you build those patterns, you should pay attention to what is stable over time, because stable traits are often the most useful for linking. Some malware families have a consistent structure, like a core loader that pulls down plugins, and those plugins may keep a similar interface even when the code changes. Some operators keep reusing the same command structure or the same way of encoding data, because changing it would require rebuilding their entire workflow. On the infrastructure side, you might see repeated registration habits, repeated hosting choices, or repeated ways of rotating domains that leave a recognizable footprint. None of these traits is perfect, and you should never pretend that they are, but stability is a clue that can help separate meaningful relationships from shallow coincidences. The more you focus on stable traits, the less likely you are to be fooled by cosmetic changes. Time and targeting add another layer, because campaigns tend to show rhythm and selectivity, and that rhythm can connect otherwise separate technical observations. If a set of organizations in the same sector starts seeing similar spearphishing lures in the same month, and the payloads share a loader family, and the command and control rotates in a predictable way, those elements together start to resemble a coherent campaign. If the malware family appears in one place, but the targeting and timing do not match the rest of the pattern, you should be cautious about claiming it is the same campaign. Campaigns are about operations, and operations have constraints like working hours, resource availability, and priorities, which create patterns even when the attacker tries to stay hidden. When you align technical data with timing and target selection, you are doing something closer to intelligence work than simple malware identification. That is the difference between naming a tool and understanding the operation that uses it. A key skill for credible connection is learning how to handle partial matches, because real-world data is rarely complete. You might have strong behavioral similarity, but weak infrastructure overlap, or you might have infrastructure overlap, but only limited malware artifacts. In that situation, the right move is not to force a clean conclusion, but to describe what you can support and what remains uncertain. You can say, for example, that the observed malware shares behavioral traits consistent with a known family, and that the infrastructure overlaps with previously reported campaign resources, which suggests a possible connection. You can also say what would increase confidence, like additional network captures, more samples, or corroborating telemetry from another location. This style of reasoning is not about being timid, because it still moves the team forward, but it avoids the trap of claiming more than the evidence actually supports. Credibility is built by being accurate under uncertainty, not by sounding certain when you are not. It is also important to understand why these connections matter, because the goal is not academic classification but improved defense. When you credibly connect a malware family to a campaign, you gain context that can influence priorities and planning. You may learn that the campaign tends to escalate from email access to lateral movement, which changes what you monitor next. You may learn that the operator frequently returns after initial access to deploy additional tools, which affects how long you keep heightened monitoring in place. You may learn that the campaign has targeted certain types of data, which guides which systems you check first and which business leaders you notify. The connection, when done responsibly, becomes a bridge between technical observations and practical decisions, which is exactly what good threat intelligence is supposed to deliver. Another beginner misconception is that attribution is required for a connection to be useful, but that is not true and it can be harmful. You can connect a family to a campaign without confidently naming the actor behind it, and you can still provide actionable guidance. In many situations, the more valuable outcome is understanding the methods and likely next steps, not placing a label on who you think is responsible. Over-focusing on attribution can also distract teams into arguing about names instead of improving defenses. A campaign profile that describes how the attacker gains access, what they do next, and how they maintain control can improve detection and response even if the adversary remains unnamed. The discipline you want is to separate what you know from what you suspect, and to keep the focus on what changes the defensive outcome. To keep your work credible, you also need to be aware of how attackers can intentionally blur these lines. Adversaries can borrow code, buy access to malware, reuse public tools, or intentionally plant false indicators that mimic another group's style. They can also compromise infrastructure that was previously used by someone else, making it look like an older campaign is back when it is actually a new operator. This does not mean you should give up on linking, but it means you should treat the linking process as adversarial, where someone might be trying to make your job harder. The way you resist that is by prioritizing deeper evidence, avoiding over-reliance on single indicators, and being clear about confidence. If you build those habits now, you will be much harder to mislead later when the stakes are higher. A practical way to think about all of this is that credible connection is a chain of reasoning that you could explain to someone else without hand-waving. You start with what you observed, like a set of behaviors on a host and a pattern of outbound connections, and you compare those observations to known clusters that have been documented previously. You identify which parts match strongly, which parts match weakly, and which parts do not match at all, and you treat mismatches as important information rather than something to ignore. You then form a conclusion that matches the strength of the evidence, and you describe what would change your mind if new data arrived. That approach protects you from the urge to oversell, and it makes your conclusions easier for others to trust. In a team setting, trust is a force multiplier because it means people act on your analysis instead of debating it endlessly. As we wrap up, remember that connecting malware families to credible campaigns is not about being flashy, and it is not about memorizing who did what in the news. It is about taking messy, real-world evidence and turning it into a careful, defensible understanding of what you are facing. Malware families give you a way to group related tools. Campaigns give you a way to understand coordinated operations, and the connection between them is only as strong as the evidence you can support. When you rely on multiple reinforcing clues, pay attention to stability, incorporate time and targeting, and speak honestly about confidence, you produce intelligence that helps defenders make better choices. Most importantly, you build a mindset that will scale as the problems get harder, because you are training yourself to reason, not just to label. If you can keep that discipline, you will be able to turn scattered technical details into meaningful insight that drives real defensive action.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.